Today we're going to talk about your fabric selection for the Civil War sampler project that we're doing on the 9 patch a day group. Now the first thing that you need to know is you have to have this book, which is Barbara Brackman's Civil War Sampler. All of the instructions for the blocks that you're going to be making are in this book. I'm not going to be providing any handouts that will tell you how to make the blocks. I will provide a finishing instructions because the quilt that's featured on the cover I think is the one that everyone wants to make, and the instructions for the blocks are included, and there's several different ways that you can put your quilt together, but they don't give you specific instructions for that. The actual quilt is pictured right inside the front cover on the first page, and you can see that it's done as a rectangular quilt set on point. So these blocks in this particular quilt were done in the 8-inch size. And you have an option in the book on all of the blocks to make them in either an 8-inch or a 12-inch size. If you're going to do this particular quilt, it's the 8-inch size that they used. There's sashing in between all of the blocks and then little 9 patches that make the cornerstones. Those sashing pieces that you see here are 1-inch strips. The blocks are 8 inches, so those would be 1 inch by 8-inch finished strips, and there's 3 of them sewn together. There's also a 9 patch in the corner of each one of the blocks. Those are 1-inch finished squares, so they're cut 1.5 inches. So keep those measurements in mind when you're selecting your fabrics. But you're going to need this particular book so that you can make the quilt to begin with. But you're going to need some fabric to go along with it. It's called the Civil War Sampler because every block in the book also is accompanied by a story from the Civil War about someone who was alive and lived through that particular era. Now, I don't have a large collection of Civil War type fabrics, but I do have sort of this kind of a style of fabric that you see here. This is the Quiet Grace collection from Kim Deal for Henry Glass Fabrics, and it contains 32 different fat quarters in this bundle. If you don't have a large collection of fabric that you think you want to work with, a fat quarter bundle is a great way to start. I'm suggesting that you need 12 of your print fabrics and 12 background fabrics because this is a scrappy quilt. It's not intended to give you yardage requirements for the entire quilt. Start with a style of fabric and you can always add to it. Kim Deal is the type of designer, like Tula Pink is, where they have a style. This collection, the next collection, and their previous collections will all kind of work together. So if you have a collection of Kim Deal fabrics, you can pull from those. And for this example, I'm showing you the Quiet Grace collection. Now, there were 32 pieces in this entire bundle. 3 of them are background fabrics. So these 3 small little prints in the cream color are the background selections for this particular group. So I would definitely be using these, but 3 is not nearly enough. You could also choose to use pre-cuts, and I happen to have these are 5-inch squares of the Buttermilk Churn Basics. So you can see that all of these fabrics in here are also that same style of fabric. So they've got the same look and feel as this, but there's a variety of them here. Now 5-inch squares for our particular project is not the most effective use of your fabric because we're going to be cutting them up for background. So 10-inch squares would work better, or I prefer to work with fat quarters. There are blocks in the book where you'll see where every background piece is a different color. And if that's the look that you're going for, then this type of pre-cut would be fine. But otherwise, get at least the 10-inch squares or something larger. Now, I'm not concerned because I have a huge selection. This is just a handful of different beiges from my scrap basket. These are all fat quarter sizes. They may have had a piece cut out of them, but I collect them and just save them for projects like this. So I'll be going through mine to choose my backgrounds for this type of a collection of fabric. Now, some of you, that might seem just way too scrappy, and you'd rather have just one fabric for your collection. So you can choose one fabric to be the background in everything, and that would mean it's the background in your blocks, and it could also be the background in your sashing. And if those two backgrounds match, that means that your blocks themselves are going to float. So if I were you, I would choose one background for your blocks and another background for your sashing so that you have a little contrast between those two. Now, how much fabric are you going to need? I have no way of knowing. I'd have to total up every single piece in there. And you have your choice of two different size blocks, an 8-inch block or a 12-inch block. So just to play it safe, having no idea how much you're going to need, I'm going to suggest you start with 2.5 yards. Now, if you have 2.5 yards of background, you're probably going to have plenty to do the quilt. I've never cared if I had leftover background fabric because it can always go into my next Scrappy quilt, so I might round that up to 3. But if you plan on using only one, get at least 2.5 yards of whatever you're going to use for your background fabric. Now, there's no way of knowing how much you actually need because that information is not included in the book. So if I were going to choose background fabrics, I would go to my stash and start and go through and choose all of the ones that I thought were appropriate. When I got to this one, I might not think it's appropriate. These are small, narrow sashings. Remember, this is an inch finished, so it's cut 1.5 inches, and this is a relatively large print. So if I were to cut 1 inch of that, it would be really busy. I don't want my backgrounds to take away from my focal prints, so I might eliminate that one. But most of these other ones in different shades of lights and darks could be used without any problem whatsoever. You can have a huge variety of them. Now, if I get too many where they all start and look the same, I'm going to pick and choose between them. I'm going to eliminate some and leave the other ones in. I want to have some that have some texture in them that read a little different. Now, this one is also a very large print, but it's a very soft print. That's more of a tone-on-tone print. So the size of the print won't be distracting the way that this one would have here. So the look that I'm going for with my quilt, I'm going to choose something that's going to be the absolute lightest and the absolute darkest. I'm also going to choose a range of color to go with. So this one reads a little orange, this one reads a little brown, this one reads a little gray. So depending on which way I would like these to lean, I think I'd probably eliminate this one because I prefer the creamier colors with this palette of fabric. So I choose all of my backgrounds Scrappy that way. Now, let's go to this bundle. When we take a look at this bundle, I'm going to try and decide if I want to set one particular color aside that's going to be my sashing. So in the book, you'll see that they're all different. And if you want to make them all different, that's not a problem at all. But once again, not everybody likes that much scrappiness. So you could choose one color to be your sashing and your 9 patches here. So let's say, for instance, that I'm going to choose black. So there are 2 blacks in my bundle. This one has little dots on it here. And this one's a print with these bigger cherries. So I could choose black to be my sashing, and I could choose one of those 2 to do it, or I could just keep adding to it, going through the stash of fabric that I have and keep selecting all of the blacks, whether they're busy or they're read more solid, and set all of those aside and say, those are going to be my sashing fabrics. Now, I'm not going to put any black in my selection, fabric selection, because I don't want it to interfere with my sashing pieces. So once we've got that set aside, it could all be Scrappy. Remember, it can all be Scrappy, which is the way it's done in the book. But if you want to set aside a specific color, you want to set that aside now. Now let's look at this selection and decide which of these we're going to use. First of all, I eliminated the gray out of my background, so I'm going to pull these 2 out. These 2 read very gray, and they could go in my background selection. This one certainly could, because it's a little creamier. or this one could if I wanted to include the gray. But I'm going to take those out from my block selection. Now, looking at the group that I have laying here, this yellow really jumps out at me. It's a pretty sunshiny yellow, but I want my colors to be more warm and deeper, kind of a toasty shade rather than a bright clear shade. So this yellow I would take out of the group. So if I tighten these up a little bit, you'll see that there's still a gold in here. Okay, that gold can stay because there's nothing wrong with having some bright in your quilt, but I want it to read a little bit tighter. So I'm going to take this one out. I have two greens here that are very much the same. They're different prints, but they're also very much the same yellowy green. We have another yellowy green that's in here already. And so I'm going to choose one or the other of these. I wouldn't use both necessarily because it would add too much green to this assortment, in my opinion. So which one would I use? It depends. There's going to be some print repeats here. So you're going to see the same print repeated over and over again in some cases. So there's that same print here. So if I choose this one, I might not choose this one, or the other way around, so that you can have a bigger variety of prints. So I'm going to choose this one to stay in here, okay? And then what else do we have that's really kind of sticking out to us? This pink is really pretty bright. Now, this warmer shade of pink works really well. We're kind of narrowing this piece down here. This pink works really well with the whole group of pieces, but it's one and it sticks out. So instead, I can eliminate it or I can add to it. So I can go to my stash that I have and pull out pinks that are from other manufacturers and I've used in my collection from other times and put those back in again. And that will fill in the pink so that I just don't have one of them as sticking out like a sore thumb. So I'm still pretty heavy on my greens here. And these are bluer greens and these are the yellower greens. It's a nice assortment going this direction, but notice that I only have one blue. Blue happens to be my favorite color. This one is a blue-green that's right here, but it still has a lot more green in it than blue. And because blue is my favorite color, I want to add more blue into my assortment. So once again, I'm going to go to my stash and pull out more blues that look right with this particular assortment. And they can be lights or darks that work in there because you want a variety. What you don't want to choose is a contemporary looking fabric that doesn't seem to fit with the style of this particular quilt line. So I think you can see what I'm going for here is it's all in that sort of that same feel, these nice warm toasty colors. I've got a variety of shades. I have a bunch of reds, a bunch of pinks, a few browns, and I have an overflowing stash in my scrap basket that I can pull from for one or two blocks. But you don't have to work with this type of color if you don't want to. Let's take a look and see what happens if we would choose batiks. For this batik selection, I've chosen this print to be my main fabric. It has an assortment of colors in it that I find really unique. There's some purple and some gold and a little orange, and it's all on this brown taupey background, which really, in a lot of cases, makes the colors pop. So because this is sort of a dark, moody print, I would want to use some light backgrounds in order to lighten up the quilt. Now, batik backgrounds come in a range of colors. Even though they all seem like they're cream and white, they really are different shades. The first few in my selection here lean towards yellow. These are more brown, and these are more on the pink side. So I can either limit or include them all. All of these would work with this particular print. But I'm leaning towards the warmer shades in the browns and pinks rather than the yellows for this particular project. Also, Because my backgrounds are so light, remember our sashing pieces, those sashing pieces go right up against our block. So if this is my block background and my sashing background, if I put these two next to each other, you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So now I have to consider using a different one for my sashing, if these are my backgrounds, so that would look good with this. But what I think I might do as an option is reverse the order of my sashing. So right now you have 2 lights and 1 dark. So I would make 2 darks and 1 light, so that the light piece would be in the center. Now that also means you have to reverse your 9 patches. That would mean you would have 4 dark squares and 5 light squares. And that works perfectly fine. It's going to be a different look, but it would still work exactly the same as the rest of the pattern. So now this would be my sashing that would be up against all of my blocks. These are my backgrounds in the blocks, so that's okay, but now I have to make sure that I have enough contrast between this and what I'm going to see as my block fabrics. So I'm still going to work Scrappy, and so I've gone to my scrap bin and pulled out a bunch of scraps to get started. Now I'm not saying I wouldn't add a whole lot more to this, but this is enough to get me started. And these are truly scrap pieces. So you can see some of them are very small and some of them are a bit larger. So this caramel color works really well, beautifully with this. And I have different size and scale prints. Some of my scraps are pretty small, but there'd be enough to make our blocks. And then some of them are multicolored, like these two. Now this, I might not want right up against that. So it would go more in the center of a block. But these would be some of my gold pieces. And then this also works beautifully with a dark brown. So I would need some dark brown pieces to pull out the chocolate colors that are in there. And they would be on the warm side. So there are warm browns and cool browns. And then I can also go back and pull out the other shades that are in here. Here's some red pieces. Like I said, I want some multicolored prints. So this one has some yellow in it. It's got some other green in it, which would be perfectly fine. It's going to scrap quilt, so it's going to work as an accent. And then I want some brighter pink shades to pick up these other colors that are in here, like that. And then obviously I need some purple. So the purples that I would like to use, there's some red purple, like this. Like I said, some of them are very small scraps. So these lean towards the red shade of purple. These lean towards the blue shade. And we have both of those colors in this background piece. So all of these would also work. Once again, I've got larger scale, medium scale, and some smaller scale prints. Some that will read as solids and some that will read as actual print prints. Now, this one reads very light compared to the rest of them, and I'm sure there's more in my stash that will read in this range as well, because I want to have enough contrast in my blocks. I don't want them all to be too dark and muddy together. So I'm going to add some solids and some other prints to this collection so that we have pieces, a variety of them to work with within every block. So if you're going to use a print like this, that's going to be kind of the theme of your piece, then you want all of your scrap pieces to go along with it. You also want to make sure you have lots of contrast between your background and your print pieces. And they don't have to have a lot of any one fabric. If you just have enough of a scrap to make 1 or 2 blocks, it's going to add to your quilt and give you that really scrappy look. Now, maybe you want to play along, but Civil War style is just not your thing, and you don't like to do Scrappy. Well, there's no reason you can't make the quilt as well. You could choose something like this. This is the decoupage print from In the Beginning Fabrics by Jason Yenter, and if this was your theme fabric, this could be your outside border fabric, and it's what you're going to use to choose all of the other fabrics that go with it. But maybe you don't want to be scrappy. So let's use all one white fabric as your background. The exact same, and this happens to be a white on white print for everything. Now, it's always a good idea to add a green. So if we add a green fabric like this, so our block fabrics would be made from Yardage, and you could choose this type of a green, or you could even have one that's more of a print. So you could use something like this that would be your green in your print. There's a lot of beautiful yellows in here, so you could choose something that was either just a little bit of a print, that's a tiny polka dot, or you can add a floral to it. This floral is from the same group. So my block fabrics are right here. They're greens and yellows. And then to pick up the other shades that are in here, I'd add at least one pinkish red color. So my blocks would all have a white background, and they would have these shades in them, and every block would have the same assortment of fabrics in it. Now we're going to separate these from the outside edge with something else. We need another fabric that's in here for our sashing pieces. So in this particular collection, something really cool to use would be a black and white check. Just a little fine line of black and white check in your pieces, your sashing pieces right here. And this print could actually be the dark in the center. You could, if you don't want to worry about a check that runs straight, you could use an all over black and white polka dot, or this is the print that came with the same collection. So you could use any of these three as your accent piece. So those would be in your sashing here. These would be in your block. All of your backgrounds would be white, and you would have what would be, think of it as a purchased fabric quilt. Now, how much do you need? If this is your outside border and your little sashings that are going in here and your 9 patches, I would say get 3 yards, just to be sure. Also, these prints here, your background, 2.5. Get 2.5 yards, and these are probably very generous. And then make sure you have a yard of everything else, because you could add another pink to it, or another yellow, or another green, if you happen to find that you're running out towards the end. And the blocks will all be mixed up in your quilt, so it won't look like you've run out and added something else. You've just changed something. So at least 1 yard of all the pieces that go in there, 2.5 of your background if you're only using 1, and then your outside border. For a print like this, I would want a really large outside border, so I would go ahead and get 3 yards, so I had enough to miter my corners and use it for the sashing on the inside of my pieces. So I hope you'll join us and play along, and I hope this helped you understand how to choose your fabrics, or a different way to look at your fabrics while you're selecting them for our Civil War sampler project.